Hello and welcome to the Cibse West Midlands Region CPD webinar on reflections on the regulation as a way of working, building regulations, approved document O. We're here today to reflect on the use of the new approved document O for England now that the regulation has been applicable to all building regulations applications since June 2022. As a reminder, approved document O overheating applies to all new build residential developments, care homes and student accommodation. The regulation requires the development of an overheating strategy demanding input from specialists. We're here today to understand what the impact is that's had from people directly involved in the application of Part O. Providing expert opinion in the assessment of overheating, we have Susie Diamond, James Healey, Sam Potter and Alex Narain. Susie co-founded Inkling, a building physics consultancy in 2011. Her core skills are using dynamic thermal simulation tools to predict the operational energy and thermal performance of buildings. She deploys these skills creatively and intelligently to enable more informed design decisions and better buildings. Susie's become an expert in the field of predicting overheating in homes. She was the lead author on Cibse TM59 design methodology for the assessment of overheating risk in homes, which is now referenced in ADO, the one-page early design stage GHA tool published in 2019 and supported the more recent retrofit version. She's a lead author in the imminent Future Homes Hub compliance guide for approved document O and is also working with other authors on proposals for updating to TM59, for which research is currently being undertaken by Loughborough University. She regularly speaks and writes blogs and articles on the topic about assessing and mitigating overheating risk. James Healey is the Director of UK Overheating, the UK's first company dedicated to the assessment of overheating for residential development, and he's an industry specialist in acoustics, ventilation and overheating. James is the principal author of the Acoustics, Ventilation and Overheating Guide, which is now referenced in approved document O. James is also part of the same group of principal authors who drafted the industry guidance on how to produce assessments compliant with the regulation and has contributed to the previously mentioned Future Homes Hub compliance guide for approved document Part O. Providing the perspective of a city centre developer and master planner, we have Sam Potter. Sam is the design director at Reef Group and architecture director at Urban R, Reef's in-house design studio. He's led the design of some of Reef's most prestigious schemes, including Cavendish Square in London. He oversees the design and management of a broad spectrum of complex mixed-use projects that deliver transformational impact in a number of UK cities within the healthcare, hospitality, workplace, retail and placemaking sectors. Sam is an architect with a passion for environmental performance and the creation of innovative public spaces. Lastly, from the house building company Churchill Retirement Living, we have Alex Narain. Alex is Group Head of Technical for Churchill Retirement Living, a national developer of retirement living properties employing over 700 employees across the group. He's a proud and respected and adept chartered architectural technologist with over 35 years in the industry. He's an expert in delivering complex projects in the private sector. His knowledge and understanding lies in technical design, contract delivery, team and project management, client representation, research, interpretation of and application of current regulations and influencing future regulations. His clear thinking and excellent communications have led him to a proven track record of process improvement. He is the past president of the Chartered Institution of Architectural Technologists, and he's also led architectural teams at Stratton Parker, Ascot Design and Adam Architecture. He currently sits on the Future Homes Hub briefings on the FLOS regulations and takes part in regular NHBC discussions on regulatory compliance and interpretation. Good evening all.
Evening.
Just a few housekeeping tasks before we get started, if I may. If you wouldn't mind keeping your cameras and microphones switched off or inactive unless you'd like to ask a question, but bear in mind that this session is being recorded and will be made available on various social media platforms, including YouTube and our podcast, for people to catch up with afterwards. Alternatively, please use the chat function to ask any questions during the presentation. I believe, James, you'll be able to pass on any slides or presentations or maybe any documents, and please get in touch for copies of any of it. But on the whole, it's more of a conversation, a panel discussion rather than a PowerPoint presentation this evening. If anybody's after a CPD certificate for this evening, please get in contact by emailing cpd@cibsewm.org, stating your name and the subject of the event and the date, and they'll be emailed to you afterwards. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you all for joining us for today's session, but also thank our speakers for sharing with us what they do today. I'm really looking forward to it. So, Susie, what's your experience of the implementation of the building regulation a year on from it being in force?
Well, there's a question. I think essentially we've all got a lot more familiar with Part O and the ADO document itself, but I don't know if it's become any clearer. I think there's still quite a lot of the water's still quite muddy, shall we say, and I think compliance is still quite challenging for some locations. We're getting a lot of questions still. You know, the work we've done with the Future Homes Hub to produce guidance, that's all been published now, so I should have updated my biog. And I know there are quite a lot of questions coming in to both them and Cibse and other places, some of which I see. I think building control are getting to grips with it. I know they're asking us questions too in terms of how to reliably adjudicate and push back where they feel the assessments are, you know, needing it. But I think on the whole, there's still quite a lot of confusion and quite a lot of frustration because it's really not the straightforward exercise that we'd like it to be. So yeah, maybe I'll save some of the other things I've got to say for the other questions we're going to get to later and let everyone else have a hello.
Excellent. James, what grey areas or interpretations?
Oh, we all do the same questions.
Yeah, same question. So I'd like to answer that. Okay. Just the experience of implementation a year on. I've seen quite a variable approach to things, but I know I appreciate what Susie said about building control, getting to grips with it. I think she's right. People are asking for evidence, which is good. But I do know that building control receive a whole variety of different outputs that they have to then interpret. And you know, I always point people to the Future Homes Hub publication on which lists out what reporting should include, because in my view that's the minimum really. But you know, there's a variable approach of what people output, and putting my environmental hat on, I think there's a complete range of I don't think the environment side of things has been accounted for anywhere near as much as it should be in these strategies. So I think that's one of the major things that I see as fairly sporadic, really. That's my experience from a year on.
Sam?
I mean, we've implemented some schemes which were with a mind to the Part A coming in, and unfortunately I think a lot of it currently is a bit of a sticking plaster, in that the main challenge we see with our urban residential items is that the external environment is rarely deemed sufficient for openable windows to be appropriate, particularly in London, and therefore we're forced into a cooling scenario within the developments that we do for residential, student, etc. And that's kind of compensated because environmentally we can deal with a lot of it with air source heat pumps and heat exchangers and the like, but at the same time we're actually creating more carbon intensive hungry buildings as a result of trying to mitigate the overheating concerns. And I think that will play out and positively. I think it's a really good thing that it's there, but getting supply chains to start to develop products which are appropriate to the changing regulatory environment is going to take a number of years. And Britain just isn't yet geared up for it in the same way that our European counterparts are, in the way that they sort of strategically tackle it in different ways. For instance, you know, external horizontal louvering, etc., vertical louvering is very commonplace. Whereas in the UK, that kind of strategy becomes quite challenging and cost ineffective because it's just not familiar yet. So I think there's a huge familiarization process going on, which has to happen against the background of rapid regulatory change in other areas of the building regulations. So we're kind of tackling it, but I do think our experience so far is we're all learning. And perhaps some of the products, residential products that are being produced are prototypes, shall we say, and hopefully in a few years' time, the whole supply chain in the industry will adapt appropriately to what is really a very positive regulation overall. That's probably our experience at Reef.
James, you want to come in there?
Yeah, sorry. Before Alex answers the question, just to feed off what Sam just said, that products are being available. I've found a real challenge with things like looking at external blinds for buildings that are more than 18 meters in height, because they just don't have the fire rating that will allow them to be used. So you automatically got this real challenge on your hands of trying to get compliance passively, because we haven't got the proper products there with the right certification to prove that they can be used.
Excellent. And what about you, Alex? What's your experience of implementation a year on from the regulation being enforced?
Good question. Thinking about it, experience is that the regulation was released. I don't think I'll be saying anything untoward here. It was released without any real education. That's my view of it. Education across the board, education of regulators, so they understood how to interpret it, how to use it and make it usable. So that dialogue that we would normally have with a regulator over new regulation coming in hasn't been there. They've been catching up since release, trying to understand it. The very fact that we've got how many pages of FAQs suggests that it's poorly written, hard to interpret, hard to understand. If you can't understand a building regulation and the guidance along with it, how on earth do you have a chance of adopting it? That's been the real challenge, I think, overall. It needed to come out. It's a new regulation. It's not an adaptation of something that was in existence. So you'd expect it not to be probably the final finished article upon its release, but it feels like it was way far off the mark to me. But we'll be talking about that a little bit later, I'm sure. My experience on the ground is I've had to work out what thermodynamics are, not necessarily let the manufacturer of products lead us, but actually understand the physics of thermodynamics, how it generally works, and through simple adaptation of design and good design, make it work for us to the best of our ability, in the sense of we're trying to come up with a passive solution with a low carbon footprint, a low energy usage moving forward, and obviously mitigate overheating during the summer months. So we're getting there, but my word, it should have been released some 6 to 12 months before it was formally introduced, and the education pieces around it should be lined up beforehand. My fear is that they'll repeat the same mistakes as we move forward to the future home standards, and I very much suspect that will happen again.
Yeah, talking about RFIs and TQs and clarifications and questions, James, what areas or interpretations have you experienced?
Yeah, grey areas. The biggest one that I find a challenge on a weekly basis is this interpretation that you only need to account for noise when it's raised as an issue at the planning stage. which is a real wrong interpretation of the regulation and requirement 012A, really, yeah, it's a challenge because you're trying to explain to your clients that if they don't account for noise at night, for example, they can't demonstrate that they're compliant with some of the sections of Approved Document O. But it's often used because there is an interpretation that that because there's wording in the document that says, for example, if planning raised it as an issue, that's taken as being gospel. That's the only time you account for it being an issue, which is just not the case. Not the case for the acoustics industry's interpretation or anyone else that could really read that in a real sense. So that's one thing that I find is a struggle with those interpretations. The other thing which the grey areas are interstitial blinds. Are they inside? Are they outside? Where do they sit? I don't know if other people on the call have had these same challenges. But yeah, I get asked it semi-regularly. You know, can we? Why do we have to have external blind shutters, for example? Can we? I appreciate we can't have curtains or internal blinds, but can we account for something that's inside the glazing? And it's not clarified anywhere, so it's a bit of a grey area really, which you have to ask. Oh, Susie's got a hand up.
we have asked that question, and my understanding is that DLUC have approved, or HSC, whoever they are now, have approved for interstitial blinds and internal shutters that are kind of built in, that they can be used within the calculations, within the dynamic modelling method anyway. But they have to be sort of installed and built in so that they're
not removable.
Well, removable, but not easily removable.
Yeah,
not
as
easily, simply as taking curtains down and putting something else up.
Yeah.
But yeah, they.
Okay.
I can't remember if it went into the FAQs or not. I'm not sure it did, but I've definitely got an email somewhere saying it's allowed. So
no,
so
it hasn't gone into the FAQs.
Yeah, that's useful. Okay, thanks.
So just a couple of inputs from the chat function. Thank you all very much for that. Part O, I believe, or the question asks, states that they shouldn't be used with regards to blinds and curtains, but TM59 says you can.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, annoying, isn't it?
And
so I've got a big development that we're looking at the TM59 analysis, which was prior to these new regulations, and we're using internal blinds as a means of compliance, because it's the only requirement is to model in accordance with TM59. But the second phase and third phase of that development is to new regulations, and we'll have to use a different approach because we can't use internal blinds. Yeah.
And you can use internal blinds, but you can't use internal blinds, but blinds between panes are a grey area.
Yep.
Yeah, well, as I've just said, I believe that they are allowed interstitial blinds because they're built into the windows, so you couldn't take them out. Where there's another grey overlap on the Venn diagram is that there's not that good modelling advice about how you model internal shutters and external shutters and stuff in terms of what impact that has on the convection coefficients and the sort of discharge coefficients for the ventilation. So we haven't really got good modelling advice on that. So it's open to modeler interpretation how they go about it.
And a last question for now on the chat is, what is the maximum noise allowed?
Well, it entirely depends on your window design. But the acoustics industry has published guidance on a means of calculating that, and in fact I've got some research papers at various conferences demonstrating that as well. But in general, if you're considering the simplified method, then anywhere outside of London it's 49 at night as an average, or 64 as a maximum noise level. But if you're in London, then it's 45 at night, or 44 at night, or 59 as a maximum outside the property, for simplified method. But in reality, if your standard 650mm reach window with a single pane could get you anywhere between 8 and 12 dB reduction, which works out as about 48 to 52 as an average at night. But if you've got 2 window panes that open, that level drops by 3 dB. So automatically it just completely varies depending on the window design, which is why what we produce is a plan to say the noise reduction that's needed, and then that informs the model about how much they can open a window or not, by using formula to work out the window opening and the equivalent area performance.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. Sam, have you come across any other grey areas or areas for interpretation?
Not so much, unfortunately, guided by people like James on that matter in my role. I think that the difficulty that we continue to have is the ability to, in this economic market, find ways to meet the full spectrum of new regulation, whether it's related to fire or it's related to heat gain, and just the lack of products, the cost of doing it. We've very rapidly, like many other developers, reached a point where housing is just not a sector which we can continue to pursue in the short term, because the ability for the UK construction industry to supply materials and labour and technological knowledge to meet the regulatory requirement and environment, combined with the situation that we have in the country, means that we're not able to actually produce housing at the moment, which is extremely concerning. And that's we certainly shouldn't be dumbing down any of the regulations, particularly Part O, because the intent is absolutely appropriate. But the way that this is going to get unlocked is through very clever thinking from the design end around the passive front, and then adaptation by manufacturers and knowledgeable contractors. As Alex said earlier, it's the education of it, not just designers and developers, but actually builders, really importantly, so that we can actually get to a point where we're able to economically build housing. And I'm sure that will come as a result of bigger macroeconomic forces, but that's the biggest challenge we've got. And so in simple truth, I'm looking less at it because we are moving into our property portfolio in other sectors, which aren't governed by Part O. I mean, I suspect they will be in future, but we're paying less attention to it because it's just simply not economic to build housing with the constraints that we have. Sorry, a bit doom and gloom, but that is the reality of what we're discovering.
What about you, Alex? Any areas for interpretation or grey areas?
Yeah, the biggest one, I think, from a design point of view has been, and it will lead us on to what I know is going to be your next question as it happens, windows and garden, and how to interpret that and where it's appropriate. I mean, there's been a separate challenge on that, but as it's written, it was a bit grey because it seems to sort of suggest, well, it does suggest that you have to set your garden at 1100, but any windows that are used for overheating mitigation. And then when you go to the regulator and they talk about it, because they don't trust the public to be educated, or again, it's the education piece, they're then saying in order for that to work, if any room in a property uses a window that's used for overheating, to make it foolproof, we're going to insist on every window in that particular room having the garden at that level, because even though one window might be used for overheating mitigation, all the others might be used, and the owners might not really understand it. You're thinking, really, that's insulting to people's intelligence, their freedom of choice, and giving them peace. So, that's not clear in the document, and I don't believe it's clearly adopted by the regulators themselves either. And because of that clarity not being there, and how it could be adopted by different people with different opinions, that's what we're landing with. So we end up with buildings with garden right along everybody's eye line, and without even thinking about the consequence of people's line of sight when I sat on a sofa and try and look out of a window with a garden right in the way, and the connection with the outdoors. And so it might solve one issue, but it doesn't consider biophilia, biophilic design, and our connection with the outdoors, and what great pleasure that brings to individuals in occupying a building. So solve one problem but create another. So I think that's a grey area of interpretation. I don't obviously agree with the way it's being interpreted, because I'm thinking about wider issues here, but that's what we've landed with at the moment.
Susie, anything to add?
Yeah, just following on from that, actually, I think my biggest area of frustration at the moment, and it does change quite frequently, if anyone's followed the blogs, there's a new one brewing, but this one is about the easily accessible windows, which are basically any window that's either at ground floor level, bedroom windows we're talking about, or any window that's above something that you could stand on, so above a garage roof or above a porch, or anything that's sort of some shading mechanisms for the ground floor. Anything that you could climb onto makes those bedroom windows easily accessible. And you can see the intent here is to reduce burglary risk and so forth of intruders getting in at night. But we're talking about occupied bedrooms here, because we're assuming in our models that these rooms are occupied at night. So there's the people sleeping in there. And what is acceptable for those windows to allow those bedroom windows to open at night are sort of grills or shutters or some sort of fairly heavy duty security device in front of the window. Or you've got to keep the window tight shut at night. Whereas what I would argue is that in the most common sense world, people would put those locks on windows that limit them to only opening like 100 mils. So it's certainly what we've got in our house is on the sash windows, you get those little bolts that mean you can open it this far and no further, or there's equivalents for all the different window opening types. Now, I think the feedback we got from DLUHC when we pressed on this one was that those sort of devices aren't secure enough for anti-burglary and so forth, which might be true if you were going on holiday for a fortnight. You wouldn't leave those windows open necessarily with those locks on if you're not there, but you're actually sleeping in this room, so you'd make quite a lot of noise trying to break those windows. And it also presupposes that burglars don't have ladders and can't bring a ladder and reach the windows that aren't easily accessible through such means. So I find that frustrating, because the solution is therefore much more draconian. Like huge grills and bars across first floor windows seems overkill for a scenario where actually a simple lock on those windows would be a much more user-friendly mechanism to solve that problem. And yes, not always would that opening be wide enough, and particularly in London and some of the harder locations in terms of overheating risk, that might not be enough. But in many locations, particularly out of town where security is not such a great risk anyway, it seems like a much more equitable, happier, cheaper human solution. So I'm really that's the bit I'm campaigning on at the moment. But I think that's quite an important one. We're also getting quite a lot of questions about internal doors and whether they can be opened at night, and I think that's feeding into the new TM59 to clarify on that one. And apparently builder control are getting some quite cheeky, potentially, selection of weather files in order to make assessments slightly easier, not necessarily choosing the nearest, but maybe justifying a further away one somehow. So I think there are some grey areas that building control are having to unravel. But those are, that's my one. Just
before I bring James in that one, I know he's got his hand up, but there's previous considerations like code for sustainable homes, and then secure by design that is at variance to the sort of natural ventilation strategy. And there's a comment in the chat there about there's nothing new about guarding. It's all in Part K. James?
Just going to support Susie said it really on the on opening a window just a little bit, because in my experience actually, and we do UK Overheating, we do modelling all over the country. My experience is, you know, when it's not in the southeast or in seems on the far west, the far east of the country, and it's more towards the Midlands or north. Even though open a little bit can make a big difference, and can make difference between a mechanical fan or not. So it really, yeah, it would really be helpful if we could have that approach at least. Yeah.
And Alex?
Yes, just in response to the Part K comment. Yeah, of course it's in Part K, but Part K for window sills actually in a domestic dwelling is 800 mil at the finished floor level, not 1100 mil. And if you're sat on a sofa looking out the window and you've got an 800 mil sill, you can see out. But if you look at a anthropometric study sat on a sofa, if you've got a garden across at 1100, you won't see out. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There is garden, but there's conflicts between the two documents in that respect. And it leads on to the question of primary evidence that was used in order to work up on Part O. That 1100 is necessary. I've challenged that. I know the Future Homes Hub has challenged it. And I know that NHBC challenged that directly through to DLUHC. I was sat on a call with DLUHC challenging them on it, and they didn't really have an answer to that other than they'd referred to some evidence that had been provided from some European studies. But to me, it didn't come across that it was either unanimous or realistic, in the sense that there's been an increase in deaths from falling out of windows because the garden wasn't set higher than 800 millimeters. The challenge I put to them was we've had our planet heating up for at least the last 10 to 15 years. So opening of windows and frequency of opening windows will have been increasing during the last decade and a half in any instance in the UK, because our summers are getting hotter. Is there any evidence to support the fact that in that last decade, as we've seen the temperatures increase, particularly in the UK, and we've hit record temperatures during summer, there's been an increase in deaths? And the answer was no. So therefore, I don't understand where the primary evidence is for that. If there was evidence to support it, of course, I'd be all for it. But at the moment, at this moment in time, it's not very well thought through. Somebody sat there, you can imagine, around a table saying, we ought to do this because there could be the possibility of a high risk, not done a background checking. All well and good if you do your homework first, but not very good if you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking of the NHBC, thank you very much for that. Does anybody know if the NHBC have commented on the 100 mil restrictors for security and easily accessible windows yet? No. Go on.
I've been raising the question. Nobody's come back to me with anything.
Yes, exactly. The question has been raised through the NHBC Technical Forum, which I sit on, for exactly that reason. Now, they have come back with a technical guidance note on overheating Part O, which was released earlier this year, but I can't recall off the top of my head whether that question's been answered in that or not, so it'd be worth cross-checking that. They may well have answered it in that.
Okay, excellent. Sam, what part or parts of the regulation would you change?
That's pretty difficult. I think the biggest thing that we suffer from is being able to get cooling. And I actually don't think it's Part O that needs to change necessarily. I think it's entirely the overarching strategy towards the occupants. The example I give is we design a lot of office, a lot of commercial, and therefore it's not governed by this issue. So and it's also not governed by strenuous acoustic issues such as overnight noise reduction. So we're in a place where we're able to deal deal with overheating in offices by having large, very large opening windows with full height veiled fall protection systems, which mean that we, through the summer months, we can go mixed mode on our cooling system, reduce our energy demand by 40 to 50%, and therefore use less carbon. We give control to the occupants. They can have natural air, but they're allowed to, but they put up with a bit of background noise in the office environment. And what we find is we get a lot, the occupants are happy in those buildings. The difficulty is obviously the issues at night in residential, and how to deal with that if you can't have opening windows and dealing with the heat. So if I were to ask, and I don't know how we do it, it's a more broad spectrum thing whereby it is partly the education, but it's getting to a point where you allow the occupants to have behavioural choice and accept compromise in certain areas, whether that is a slightly noisier environment, slightly warmer environment, and hopefully all of these things will change as design evolves and the industry evolves, and primarily the external environment, whether it's temperature or noise or air pollution, improves, because there is a disconnect between the ambition of the regulation and the actual practical environment into which we have to produce these buildings. But having said that, I think the regulation and its intention is appropriate. It's for us to work hard at meeting those objectives, but also to persuade those in the industry that perhaps we should allow occupants a little bit more choice in how they use their buildings to ensure that we get better products. So kind of a roundabout answer and a slightly frustrated one, but that's where we stand on it.
No, that's good. Thank you very much for that. And what about you, Alex? What parts of the regulations would you change?
I'd like for them to rewrite the regulation and bring into it the FAQs at the same time. The unintended consequences that have flushed themselves out in relation to other building regulations, I'd like to see them brought in line. What would be great is, we talk about floss regulations, would be great if we had an overall volume of floss so they're all read as one document, I think, because they are so interactive with one another. But particularly when you think about overheating, the effects on Part L and the competing resolution. So, for example, you might use improved solar glass to mitigate overheat in summer, but then, of course, that affects your Part L because you're using more energy in winter to compensate for that. And bring those things together. That would be, I'd love to see that. I'd also love to see, yeah, like I say, it just more clearly written. I also think it was packaged up in the wrong way. I think the third part of the document should be the first part of the document, and it would naturally lead on from that point, rather than you're trying to get your head around it, scratch your head, and you get to part 3 and think, oh, if only I'd started by reading that first, that would lead me on to the rest of it. I agree with Sam in the sense that, the sentiment and what they're trying to achieve is absolutely appropriate. And all the regulatory change that we're facing at the moment is driven by 3 key things: inclusive design, because of an aging demographic, inclusive and accessible design, I should say, building safety off the back of Grenfell, and again, that needs to be addressed, and of course, climate change. But those 3 things working together are leading to a whole plethora of changes. So that's why we've got them, and I think once we realise those three key drivers, then we understand what needs to be done, and all these things should be probably addressed a long time before now, but we're where we are, and we are now at least addressing these things and moving forward, which is a really positive thing. But yeah, that's what I would change in respect to Part O.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. I saw Susie rub her hands in glee, so I'm sure she's champing at the bit. But Susie, what parts of the regulations would you change?
Oh, well, if anyone's read my blogs, there's a long list. But I completely agree with Sam and Alex. It's hard to lose sight of the intention, and the intention is really solid on this. We should be checking and worrying about overheating risk for new homes. That is important. I think at the moment, what I'm thinking about most is the simplified method is not simple. We've known that from the get-go, and I think I would like to see it simplified, particularly for the lower risk locations. I think it's frustrating that it's so hard. It's very unintuitive, so it's quite hard to look at a scheme and know instinctively whether it'll pass or fail, in a way that I can do more so with TM59. I've got more of an instinct for that than I have for the simplified method, which is frustrating, because actually the simplified method, it should be simple. But because it lurches around depending on your floor areas and your glazing areas and your orientations and your, you know, it makes it hard to be confident. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think that frustrates everyone, that it's not simpler. The other thing that's a bit more niche, but the other thing that's really bugging me at the moment is, apart from what I've already gone on about, the nighttime bedroom window opening regimes within the modelling side of TM Part O, that they've changed TM59 for reasons that they haven't justified. So there's deviation from what TM59 says and what Part O says, which is confusing for modellers, and it's not, if they haven't given a rationale or an evidence base for why bedroom windows need to be either open wide all night if it's 23 degrees when you go to bed at 11, or shut, completely shut all night if it's below 23 when you go to bed at 11 p.m. I think the thinking behind it is probably sensible, in that the argument is that people don't wake up in the middle of the night to open or close windows, but actually what they do is leave it a bit open at night, because it might get warmer, it might get colder. And what the consequence of this is, what we're seeing is east-facing bedrooms, which are cooler in the afternoon and therefore more likely to be under 23 at 11 p.m. But then the windows are shut all night, and at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. in the middle of early summer, the sun comes up. We've got no curtains, remember? So the sun comes streaming through really early in the day to those east-facing bedrooms, warms them up. You cannot open the windows until, I think it's 7 or 8 a.m. when the occupants are deemed to be awake. And those early hours clock up on the overheating and you fail. And there's very little design-wise you can do, apart from try and make them overheat more during the day by having bigger windows in order for, you know, it's a small issue, but it affects some bedrooms, and it's really frustrating because you can't actually design it out, and it drives me slightly mad. So I don't know why they've implemented that. It seems really counterintuitive. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, rant over. That will be in my next blog as well. Apart from that, yeah, I mean, I think I agree. They're totally written in the wrong order. Really annoying, because I think people miss the bits that's mandatory, whatever method you're following, because that comes up last. And I'm hopeful. I mean, I'm not hearing good things, but the Future Homes Standard consultation is due out, has been due out for some time now. I believe it's going to cover Part O, but I think there is scope within consultation feedback for people to sort of campaign for Part O to be tweaked, if not fully updated, within that Future Homes consultation. So we'll see.
James, did you want to come in
there? Perhaps the only time I could ever perhaps correct Susie, because most of the time she's correcting me. But on the FAQs of ADO, and this is what our industry latched onto, is that it, and I'll put it in the chat box, a snapshot. It does say that if you want to provide noise attenuation, you can open the windows a smaller amount at night. So the wording in the printed version of ADO says if it hits 23 degrees at 11 p.m. They should be fully open. But this section FAQ 14 clarifies that you can have them open a smaller amount of night to provide noise attenuation. So you can actually model them differently at night to get you that noise attenuation.
But what triggers them to open is still the same. They open less, but you can't open them. You can't open them when it's cooler than 23 degrees at 11 p.m. You can't open at all.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. So
it's still, yeah.
And also the one thing that we've developed is so I think depending on the software you use, you can define how the windows open at different times of the day. But in IES, for example, you can't. You set the opening. You set it to open in accordance with that scripted profile that that ADO defines, and you set the equivalent area for the opening, for example, and it follows that process day or night. So we've had to rewrite some of the Python script to actually tell the modeling to open a capped amount, to open fully in the day, but then a reduced amount, but only triggered if it hits 23 at night, and a fixed profile at night. So it's taken a bit of working of coding to actually get the software to do what really we need to do as standard as for to account for noise properly at night. So yeah, there's all sorts of intricacies that we have to do, unfortunately, to get this to work.
And James, what part of the regulations would you change if any?
I would actually. So we're building all these buildings, and they're being signed off right now, labelled as controlling overheating. But in 30 years' time, or not even that, now, to be honest, that we get extreme events, and the modelling we're using doesn't account for those extreme events, and we still want those houses to be used in 30 years' time. We're not accounting for future use of the house at all. And I would like to account for a more future weather file scenarios, so that we know that what we're building can be used, and it's sustainable. Basically, it can be used into the future as well. That would be the one thing that I would change. But obviously, lots of other little things that I've mentioned previously, but that would be the biggest thing, which I think should be embedded.
And thank you for that, James. Alex, what advancements are you focusing on in the near future?
Yeah, so we're obviously thinking quite carefully about the future home standards and trying to understand what that might look like moving forward. In a sense, particularly Part L, and therefore the adjustments needed for Part L are going to affect our Part O, of course, and the way that we mitigate heating, because we'll improve our U value of our fabric. We've tried to do a big step change in the built product of what we put together under the FLOSS regs, rather than just comply with our building fabric. We've beefed it up quite a lot so that we don't have to over repeat the exercise again in 25 to reduce our overall carbon emissions in any instance. So in that respect, I think we're relatively ahead of the game. I'm just really watching this this space. I'd like to be in a position early part of next year of working out all of our mitigation solutions for the future home standards, but that's obviously reliant upon them releasing the consultation, so that we have an idea what it's going to look like, rather than we second guessing it. So as soon as that's released, we'll be looking at what advancements we might be making to our built product. And I know that there'll be a heat pump push on that. I'm not convinced that's going to be the only solution. I'd like to see a wider variety of solutions available, and metrics built into SAP energy modelling software to allow us for emerging technologies as they come through, rather than it being a repeat of what we've had last year, which is fairly two-dimensional, and what we can put in. Unless the product's there and recognised by our software, it can't be accepted, or we lose points over it, so to speak. So I'm hoping that the delay in the release of the consultation is good news for us, in the sense that there's a bit more refinement to the tools that we'll be using to prove compliance for the future home standards. So really, that's where we are, and we're looking at a plethora of different technologies at the moment, that some of which are already mainstream, such as Mixergy cylinders. I'm thinking very carefully about simplicity of running, future replacement of any kit that we're putting, but first and foremost, making the fabric work for us above all things, before we think about any technological interventions.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat about perhaps adopting the Mediterranean approach to buildings, i.e. heavy mass, external shutters, siestas.
Yes. Yeah, I'd love to see more of that, because we don't have to look that far afield. Whoever's made that comment's absolutely right. to see solutions that have been working for centuries and working very effectively. And yet what I do find here in the UK is a very slow take up on that, not because we don't want to develop in that way, just because we know that we're likely to be greeted by a lot of adversarial response from local planning authorities, unless it fits the vernacular that's suited to the UK climate for the past number of hundreds of years. They're not always that receptive to it, and that's the thing. I think again they have to be educated and catch up and have to be willing to accept these new vernacular styles coming in order to overcome the climate emergency, which I would have thought would be the highest priority for a local planning authority, but doesn't always seem to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just conscious of time with just 5 or so minutes left. So James, what parts of the regulation, sorry, what advancements are you focusing on in the near future?
Well, again, I put I'm here representing environmental elements to this standard, and there's a big mismatch between what modelers assume and what can be allowed for acceptable use for accounting for the noise environment. And so if you're lucky, you'll have a noise report that will say, you know, windows can be opened here, or windows need to provide this noise reduction. But then that coordination between that and the modelling that's undertaken is very rarely happens. And if it does, it's either open or closed. Basically, there's very little middle ground. And what we're doing is at the moment is researching the exact performance that you get in terms of noise reduction from various window openings, side hung, top hung, in different situations. In fact, we've got a paper at the next Cibse technical forum symposium in April on our open window research, and we propose a method which will combine the equivalent area the modelers need with the sound insulation that you need to sufficiently account for noise at night. So that's one thing that we're advancing our knowledge on, and actually trying to upskill the industry to be able to get these things to work all coordinated.
And Susie, what advancements are you focusing on in the near future?
Okay, the main thing that I'm working on is that I'm leading the group for Cibse that are working on the update to TM59. And I have to caveat that by saying that we've had no confirmation from HSE that they will incorporate a new version of TM59 into Part O. That will be up to quite a lot of lobbying in order to hopefully get that adopted. But it's based on research from Loughborough University that have indicated that the bedroom criteria that we're currently using are more onerous than they need to be, in terms of actually when they've done big surveys looking at actual incidents of overheating, like reported overheating from people in their actual homes, and how that compares against the TM59 26-degree overnight threshold. And it's about 4 times higher, the 26-degree threshold, than what people actually report, which suggests that we can so what they proposed is the new criteria looking at overnight running mean, so a little bit more sort of towards the adaptive approach, and we're currently testing that at the moment. We've sent that out to a whole load of modelers who are testing it on current projects to see how that performs. We're also looking at incorporating, James will be pleased to hear, future weather data. So Cibse are currently updating their weather files based on the UK CIP 18 projections. The files we currently use are UK CIP 09 projections. So obviously climate science is moving forward. So these new projections are different and will result in different weather files. We're having some issues with those at the moment in terms of, you know, they lurch about a little bit. But what we're hoping is that we will start adopting a 2050 weather file, because quite rightly 2020s is no longer future, 2020 is now. So 2050 compliance weather files for TM59 and these changed bedroom criteria. What we're concerned about is that if we go too far, it'll make criterion B a lot easier, but criterion A harder, which is the living room criterion. We just need to be mindful that it's still feasible, and that it's correct comfort wise, but also that it's feasible to meet sort of passively and so forth. There's quite a lot of work being done on that. We were hoping to publish by the end of the year. It's looking like it'll be sometime early next year now. But like I say, whether or not that will get adopted into Part O would make it a bit of a red herring if it doesn't. So I guess that's partly a little call out to industry and our friends to help us lobby for it if you see value in those improvements. And we're also trying to clarify a few points within TM59 that have come up as a result of it being more heavily used at the moment. So yeah, watch this space.
Excellent, thank you for that. And Sam, what about you? What advancements are you focusing on in the near future?
I mean, I'll try and keep it short. It's principally education. There's a good question in the chat about occupiers' understanding and the products that they have. For example, we completed a residential building I mentioned earlier where we've got cooling to compensate for the heat gain in summer because we're not technically able to open windows. What we ended up doing was employing somebody to talk to all the new occupants of the 25, 30 odd apartments and say, we've installed opening windows. If you want to save money on your energy and you don't mind a little bit of noise at night, open your windows. You won't need the cooling. It's bad for the environment. If you can deal with the noise, then you'll save money. Most of them leave the windows open at night. When I've been past there late in the evening, that's most of the windows open at night, and they save the money. So it's quite interesting, these anecdotal ways of looking at it. And that was just a simple piece of education, and sadly a bit contrary to the regulation, but it gave people choice. But at the same time, Alex touched on, we're trying to educate planners because we often come up with great passive schemes and they can't get their heads around how that will fit in adjacency to a conservation area, or how that can be deemed to fit in, even though they understand there may be advancements in technology. So it's trying to move on the various competing aspects that we have there, and then obviously working with the trades a lot and trying to get them to collaborate and work with us on innovative technologies that will allow us to deliver what appear like quite simple things to build into the fabric in residential buildings where there isn't a lot of money, but it's taking time. So it's never a simple answer. It's the focus is across all the aspects, but always looking at delivery and actually how we make these things happen, rather than keeping it at cerebral level. Yeah, that's us.
Excellent, that's great. Thank you all very much. I'm conscious of time, so if you do have any time constraints, then by all means, please drop off the call. But in the meantime, there are a few questions in the chat. So Sam, I think you referenced the occupiers and understanding the challenges, and there's a subsequent one talking about explaining to clients about the grey areas who don't want to know the technical intricacies. They maybe just want the solutions. But comment in the chat from Steve, there's also been a recent report suggesting we're going to hit the 1.5 degree mark much quicker, so it'll be interesting to see how this impacts on the weather map. And then another question in the chat, will planning use the updated TM59, which will essentially force it into Part O? Alex, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I thought that I saw that comment about the 1.5 degree mark being reached much faster than originally anticipated, and I think anyone would be a fool to try and suggest otherwise. In actual fact, looking at the evidence, yeah, it's been a question on my own mind as well, and picking up on what Susie was speaking of earlier, with possible to a new TM59 modelling convention raising the actual threshold of what's acceptable, but then looking at the future weather file. I mean, I don't know much about what does the 2050 weather file look like, and what's the trajectory to that? Is it trajectorized on the basis of where we are currently in society, or does it take into account the possible reduction in carbon emissions as time goes on, and therefore it would then tail off? And maybe even though we would hit 1.5 degree increase a lot sooner than first anticipated. Obviously, we're only one small nation amongst the whole world here, and there's a lot of other powers at play. I guess my question, and I don't know if anyone in the panel knows the answer, would be, is that predicted to flatten off, or are we looking at a 2050 weather file that, in order to compensate for that, for overheating moving forward, that the raising the threshold really doesn't make a blind bit of difference because the mitigation measures will become greater yet again? What's your thoughts on that, I guess, to Susie and James?
Yeah, we're looking at the Cibse weather data at the moment, and it's still in development, but it does include different emissions scenarios. So depending on what our global emissions do, I think there are different trajectories plotted. So it means you get a plethora of weather files based on 2020s, 2050s, 2080s, but then with different emission scenarios and different percentile kind of outputs. So which file is chosen to be the sort of key one for TM59 is one question, and then ideally people are starting to look at further ahead, just to see, but which one is appropriate. I guess societally we'll have to decide.
Yes.
But yeah, so there are different emissions built into the.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
excellent. Well, that was really interesting and informative. Thank you all very much for that. I especially like the discussions and comments about the Mediterranean, and what springs to my mind is the likes of adiabatic cooling and other sort of technologies that are deep rooted in history. But in closing, just a plug for some of our future events, if I may, before we go any further. So our next event is on the 21st of November, which is an access control event titled Securing the Entrance Controller Solution, followed on the 28th by a new Cibse Guide M Maintenance Engineering and Management webinar with the Cibse FM group. So pleased to talk about that one. But the main highlight really in the short-term future is also on the 28th over at Faisley Studios in Birmingham. We've got an in-person Building Safety Act event, which has the Cibse Chief Technical Officer, Hal Davis, as keynote speaker, along with some colleagues from Hydrock and other companies. You can sign up to attend and benefit via our Eventbrite page. We'll also be streaming that and on YouTube afterwards. Details in the chat. And you can catch up with our events by subscribing to our YouTube channel. And any feedback and thoughts and comments would be welcome by emailing feedback@cibsewm.org. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everybody who's joined us for doing so this evening. It was great to have you with us. Thank you very much. And also thank our speakers and presenters, along with the teams behind the scenes that have supported them to make today's event possible. Thank you all very much. I look forward to meeting and welcoming you to a Cibse West Midlands region event in the near future. And I wish you well for the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.